episode, we talked to Rahil Mohsen, who is a comic artist, and he very graciously explained the comic art process. Today, we talk to the other side of comics, which is comic writing. And to explain the process of comic writing, we have someone very special, whom I have been following for a long time, and I'm a huge fan of. He has contributed a lot to the Indian comic scene. Welcome, CG Salamander.
Hi everyone. That's a very generous introduction.
Hi. Yeah, CG has been CG is a prolific writer. He has written for children's book as well as I think fiction, non-fiction, and things like that. But mostly we are focusing today on his comic career. Also, he has written comic books like The Map Maker, Incredible Acts of Thomas, Jellyfisher, Boy and the Town, Gandhi, Journey Train comic, and my favorite, which is Maithili and the Minota, which Penguin has brought up. He has worked along with Raji White on that book. So we have lot to get to and lot to talk to. So welcome again, CG.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah. So CG, we will start from the beginning. So we'll focus on comic, but how did you start your writing career, and how did that turn into this comic as well as children's book writing?
So actually, one of the first things that I've ever published officially was a comic, and this was published by Manta Ray back in 2013, I think. And Manta Ray, for those who may not know, is basically what Kochi used to be.
Okay.
But there were two partners. So there was Dilip, and then there was Tina and Pratik. And Dilip used to run the Mint, which is like the big picture and the small picture stuff. So what happened was that I wanted to get into writing basically, and I'd heard that Kochi, that they were going to come and visit Chennai. They were going to be in the library or something. So I just sort of happened to be there and met them and said, hey, look, I write stuff. So would you like to see something that I've written? And they said, yeah, sure thing. Send us a few comic pictures basically. And at that time, I don't think I knew how to write a comic or I didn't know how to script one. So I just said, yeah, okay, I know how to write a comic, but secretly didn't. Went back, went to a secondhand bookstore, and I found three very important books. I think one is Understanding Comics, which I didn't read at the time, but the other two was, I think it was Arkham Asylum, but it also had the entire script for the thing behind the book.
Okay.
And Sandman Dream Country, I think, also had the script for the comic behind. So once I saw how the comic script was written, and kind of it was mostly just flipping back and forth between the script and then the panels itself, and then I kind of realized what was going on, and that was all the introduction that was necessary. And over the years, I think I would just refer to Understanding Comics as to see if they've done anything special, but mostly it was just these two books that I used as a jumping off point. But yeah, anyway, so, and then I kind of made 3 or 4 pitches that I sent to Tina and Pratik. And I remember there were these huge comic pitches that I had. Like one was around 80 pages and one was around 25 pages, like the scope of the work. And then finally, the one that they said they wanted to publish was a comic that was a Matchbox comic.
Oh, yeah.
And it was, I think, a few panels in length. So it was maybe around 15, 20 panels at the most. And it was illustrated by Sandhya Prabhat, who also happened to be with me when we met Tina and Pratik. So it made sense to go about it together. Yeah, and that was the very first comic that I published. And from there on, I think...
What was the theme of the comic? Matchbox?
So I think the one that they gave us was love. I can't say the word love. The Tamil accent sort of comes through. But yeah, so I think I still remember what it was. It was about Quicksand Girl and Cement Boy.
Okay.
So it goes Cement Boy, loud quicksand girl. He felt she made his stomach swirl.
Mhm.
He was dry and she was wet. The world froze over when they met.
Oh,
So
it's a
essentially,
poem.
it's just,
A poem.
yeah, yeah, sort of, yeah.
Nice.
And basically, again, the illustrator brought it to life because it's essentially this moving piece of a sack of cement that just ambles around, walks around, and then finds this little puddle of quicksand and then
Quicksand.
kind of spills into it and then just kind of freezes over.
Oh,
So
nice.
yeah, it was just fun. It was nice when this came alive because you see for the first time what a comic can actually do. Um, but yeah, so this was the very first thing I've gotten published, and then on, I think Dilip wanted me to pitch for the big picture,
Mhm.
and then it became the small picture at some point as well.
Okay.
Um, so yeah, so I think I
The
published around 15
big
to
picture
20
was
comics.
like a monthly publication, right? Of Mantave.
So the Mint used to bring it out. I think it was called the Small Picture first,
Okay.
and then it was this entire full spread of the Mint basically, where it would be one comic.
Mhm.
And I think it was like a huge paper, so it was around what was the size? A3 size. I
A3
don't know. It
size.
was like the
Okay.
standard newspaper size.
Uh-huh.
Um, yeah, and I remember a lot of the other comic writers and artists used to contribute to it.
Mhm.
And over the years, I've done many comics for them across, different formats because it used to be this one A3
Mhm.
sheet in the start, and then later on it became 10 panels, and then at
Okay.
one point they moved to the big picture, which was 45 panels, and I think the largest comic I've done for them was around 60
Oh,
panels or so. And
the
this was actually the first time I've
60
also
panels will be in one single sheet.
no, so they moved online as
Ah, yeah.
time progressed.
Mhm.
Yeah. So I this is also the first time I worked with Rajiv.
Mhm.
We worked on this thing called of Jallikat and Picasso's Bulls, which is one
Okay.
of my favorite comics till date. Uh, because I could really see the synergy and that sense of just the two of us collaborating. It just felt
Partnership
like
forming
magic.
between
And
Rajiv. Oh,
exactly.
that's very
Yeah.
nice. Just a quick sideway question, like this limitation of space, right? Which, like all these publications have. With generally this, like I do it most of my stuff independently, but when you are doing it for a publication and they have this limitation of space, does that affect your writing? Like how do you tackle that challenge? Like this. Okay, this is the space limitation and work with it. And,
I can give you two examples, one where I stick to it and one where I break it because and I think one is an example of achieving it and the other is an example of failing, but then doing so because the comic needs you to fail. Um, so usually if there is a page count, so when I work with publishers like say Comic Sense, which is a magazine where they're like, you only get 4 pages, or
exactly.
once they said you only get 9 pages, but I said I definitely have to have 11, and then they somehow made it work. But basically, it causes a headache for everyone, for like people in production, for the editors, so on and so forth. So mostly when they say you have to stick to the page count, you have to stick to a page count, and that's also fun because that constraint, it's kind of challenging, and you set your mind to it, to making sure that it works, and then you kind of
Exactly.
cut down and distill it and make it as tight as possible.
You are editing while you're
And
writing. Yeah.
that's right, yeah. Or in the other hand, for Maithili, so the second Maithili book is going to come out, I think next month, October, and it's called Forest of Forgotten Fears. Over here, it's a 64-page book, but right from the get-go, I was like, I can't do this in 64 pages. It won't make sense. I said I need at least 84 pages to do it.
Okay.
And eventually they agreed. But this is a case where I knew that the story cannot be told in 60 pages because it'll be choppy if I did that. And I'm really happy that that Penguin kind of gave us the leeway to play around and take those extra pages as well. But yeah, it completely depends on the size of the story you're saying. If it's a short comic, then I think it very much is possible. But if you're working on a longer piece of work, then in some cases you can't adhere to the page count. So yeah.
Okay. Then anyway, you have bought Maithili and Minota early in the conversation, so I will get to it. Like, how did that idea came into being, and when did it start? Basically, was it like, was the publishers approached you guys, and then you guys started, or you and Raju started together?
Rajiv and I started this a long time ago.
Okay.
This is where Rajiv got catfished into doing this because
Okay.
it started in 2015, where
Oh, wow.
we had the characters Maithili and Minotaur, basically. And then it was serialized for a children's magazine called Jellyfish Monthly.
Okay.
Uh, at its peak, Jellyfish Monthly had around 4,000 readers, basically
Readers. Okay.
4,500.
Was this an
Um,
online magazine or
no,
no
print,
print? Okay.
which is why you can't find those individual serialized bits of Maithili and the Minotaur
Maithili and the Minota
online.
online.
Yeah.
Okay.
So so we worked on this, and initially, I told Rajiv, hey, let's start something, and it'll be like Peanuts, or it'll be like, one of those.
Calvin and
Um,
Hobbes and okay.
exactly, yeah. Just like you have the setup, and then you have that middle bit that kind of pulls it, and then you have the punchline. From there, it grew to, you know what? Let's do a one-page comic where you have like these different situations, and then it kind of just takes care of itself. Then it grew to a four-page comic. And then before you know it, like a sense of a narrative was kind of forming. And at that point, I said, yeah, you know what? This is a book that is definitely like 3 pages. There's world building. There's a lot going on here. There's so much more for us to do with it. And we have, or at least in my head, this is a 9-book long series because you need the time and that space to tell this story. Um, so yeah. Sorry, did I like deviate from your question?
No. You haven't on the right question, but I have like more questions now because like when you
Yes.
started with Jellyfish, was it the same structure like one girl in this unknown school where all the other students are basically like animals? Like, that is the setup of my Diamond. Like in a nutshell, that is what it is, right? Like a student who is
Sort of,
like
yeah.
a human student is like she's the other when you consider
Yeah.
everybody else is a animal character. So that is how it started from Jellyfish itself, or did that come later?
Yeah, so that's the basic premise as well, to have this child who is kind of alien to this new
Mhm.
world, and it's this fantastical world that's bordering this South Indian village, basically. And we what we did was we with the magazine we didn't explain anything. It's like, I mean, even the books, it kind of just takes off,
Yes, correct.
but more so with the with Jellyfish, because we just went for it and then
Mhm.
came back at a later point and then started adding some of the world building to it. um, so yeah, so that's what's happened with the first book.
Mhm.
And the way we worked on the second book is a lot different from the way we worked on in the first book, actually. And I think it's a more sustainable, better form of working. So yeah, but
Uh,
more about that later.
okay, all right. So yeah, so how was it different? The new book, like the in the first book, what came first? Like this idea, did you have to completely rethink the whole series because it was like episodic, like let's say Peanuts or Calvin and Hobbes, and now we are actually bringing an overarching narrative to the entire story. So did you have to rethink the characters, change things like that so that it fits a larger narrative?
It's a good question, but to be honest, not really, because we found that the story was evolving in that direction.
Okay.
Like when we
That is
were
when,
doing
okay.
it, yeah, because when we did do it, like if you see a lot of these chapters kind of become an individual, um, you will find them in an individual issue of Jellyfish Monthly. So you will have the first chapter there, the second chapter will also be there somewhere. When we what we did do is that we went back and gave Arachne a better arc. And then we kind of added to the world and the world building basically. And those are things that we changed. But honestly, the story was just like moving in that direction. And I think Maitli is an example where we sort of follow behind the story, and the story kind of just takes us along and tells us where we need to go, which is often the best kind of the most fun bit basically, because as creators you also have fun writing this and illustrating this, and you just see where it takes you. Yeah.
Yeah. Speaking about Arachne, which is, I think she is basically the soul of the first book because it's her, she has a whole arc in the story. While I feel like we are getting more and more introduced into Maithili, Minotaur, and their journey has just begun. But I think in the first book, Maithili and Minotaur and the Web of Wu, Arachne is the one who has like at least an arc, which is it's almost like empathizing with the villain in a way. So
Yeah.
yeah, so I would say like there is a sense of politics which is there in Maithili and Minotaur, right? Like, so when did that decision come, and how did you think of balancing it without making that fun element of a children's book, without diluting that fun aspect of a children's book?
So I think I've always been fascinated with villains. They make for the best characters because the way I like to think of villains is that they are kind of heroes of their own story and they have their own ideals and that they're just on this path. But it's just that, you know, it's not their focal point through which the story is seen. So they seem evil and villainous basically. And I think this is like a really nice way to write villains where you understand where they're coming from or you understand exactly who they are as characters, and then kind of give them that arc. With regards to the politics of it, I don't think we thought too much about it, because at the forefront, both of us want this to be
A children's book.
a very kind of, you know, interesting, fun read. And any politics that we put in is, if we do so, will be buried under layers and layers and uh, invisible and just sort of mostly it'll just be the two of us sitting and saying, "Oh, okay, this is something that
Yeah, I think it's
done."
just for let's say like adults to just connect the dots, but children
Yeah,
wouldn't even think about it. They will be just along with the story. Yeah, I think that's a great
y-
approach which I liked in the first book.
yeah, and I guess like with the more reads it's given, you find out more things as well. And but something that I personally love is when somebody picks up on like a Hollywood reference, because there are these
Yeah,
obscure jokes that we put in there,
yes,
that I put in, and yeah, and one or two people will actually say it, and then it just makes me so happy. It
makes your day.
makes it feel like we've won, yeah, because someone's got that very obscure joke.
Yeah, absolutely.
Um,
Uh,
so
I feel like what I liked about Maithili and the Minotaur was like it's really written with a children's perspective. It uh, doesn't try to be talking down to children. It's like it's along with the children. If somebody can like easily start traveling with Maithili, and also it's done in a way it's not too doesn't explain too much to the children because I feel that uh, the kids these days are very perceptive and they can really get on, but there is, as you said previously also, there is not much exposition going in. There is no setting up of the world and things like that. We are just quickly starting with the journey. So those decisions, when you're working with a major publisher like Penguin, did they interfere? Like they do they come out and say that okay, maybe you need to explain this a little bit more to the kids so that they understand it better? The target audience might like because I feel definitely because I have children at home and they have enjoyed Maithili and Minotaur a lot, so I know that they don't need much explaining. But when you are working with a major publisher, is there any challenges like that when they interfere with the story, or you had full freedom?
so I think Maitli came out at an opportune time where we had full freedom. There were stories in the past where publishers have interfered, and it either worked out to benefit the story or seriously damage it. Um, with Maitli, we had complete freedom to do this, and actually, this is also a good point to talk about the third sort of half of Mythili in a minute, or which is the one behind the scenes basically, and that's our editor Smith. So yeah, so Smith basically I think has one of three functions that she routinely does, and the first one is that she reads it and says if everything is fine and helps us spot mistakes or plot errors that early on, so that Rajiv doesn't need to go and change it back basically. And then the second thing that she does is she looks for consistencies and stuff like that, and also most importantly makes, she's kind of like the project manager of this, wherein she makes sure that the timelines come through, and she's sort of our mediation point between Penguin and Rajiv and I. So it's really nice to have this human connect who just kind of um, is the go in between, and understands the comic process, understands everything that goes into the story, and make sure that both Rajiv and I have the time, the space to develop this, and also kind of like takes care of the other side, which is talking to the publishers about it. So that's always really nice to do, and I think that's the most important thing that she does for the book. But finally, and the most important, some the thing that I feel is the most important is that uh, I've asked Smith to tell me if the second book is better than the first book. And I think this is really important because she is the first reader of the comic. And I strongly believe that every comic you put out should be better than the previous one. Um, and yeah, and that way you know that the progression is going in the right way, and you know that the series is sustainable and that more people are going to read it. So yeah, just thought it was a good
Mhm.
point in the conversation to plug in the editor who
Yeah, that's great.
rarely gets any credit
Yeah,
for the
yeah.
process. Yes.
Oh, that's wonderful. Yeah. So now, could you like explain the process, like the technical process which is involved behind not just Maitreya and Minota? You can talk about other process as well. But when you work with an illustrator, they are coming with their own uh, visual sensibilities. They have their own visual storytelling styles, and you have your own. Like you are the one who's starting with the vision of the book, and you know that the book should be presented in a certain way. But when working with such creative comic creators who like I know that Rajiv is a comic writer in his own right. Like I have read his books like Daga and all, and that is he has his own visual sense. So how do you strike out that balance between a comic illustrator while writing books?
It's a really good question, and it's actually very easy for me to answer this because, in all honesty, I don't strike this balance at all.
Okay.
Um, because I think I'm of the school of thought where the book ultimately, for better or worse, is the writer and the illustrators. They're the two half of the comics, basically.
Mm.
And so I think I'll go back and answer your question about the process in a bit.
Mm.
But philosophically, I just feel like these are two halves. So once you do your bit, you're done with your bit, and then you pass it along. And it's up to the illustrator to kind of it's their vision that then carries the comic forward. And in many cases, it can break it. It can ruin it. In many cases, it can make it much better than it initially was. And I'm more than willing to sort of take that gamble because yeah, because it just kind of makes sense when you strike gold, then you just keep doing that basically. And yeah, so in all honesty, I don't strike that balance as much, except for this one piece of work that's been sitting with me for about 3-4 years. I've been fine tuning it, where I think it needs to be very particular, and hence it's kind of sitting here. But otherwise, I feel like I have a lot of stories in me, and just give it away. And if it doesn't work, then it doesn't work. There are more stories that I will come up with. But talk about the process itself. It kind of depends on the kind of comic I'm doing, because the process for a book like Mythili, which is very much creator owned, which is Rajiv and I own the rights to pretty much everything. It's very different from a commissioned piece of work where you're expected to produce a comic that has certain aspects to it. And I think my most recent project was to make this non-fictional or semi a creative non-fiction narrative about this freedom fighter Usha Mehta.
Oh, wow.
And it's this 100-panel comic, and it was commissioned by the Asia Institute in Texas or something like that. So I feel like, just with something like that, you need to have everything down on paper, because you have a panel count. Okay, so 100 panels is the maximum panel structure that they would like. So then you need to do your research. You need to build up everything and kind of write it down. I usually write it down in a notebook, something like this. There's a bunch of these just lying around. So I usually write it down, or sometimes draw the thumbnail bits before I actually start scripting it. Um, and yeah, and with these kind of books, it's a very structured approach, because ultimately this also makes the money, basically. But in a book like Maithili or a children's book that I'm doing, it's very different, because it's the way I think of it is I'm in charge of the plot. So I script the entire thing, the structure and everything, and then you have all of this in one place. And then the story kind of goes to uh, Rajiv, where he is mostly, I feel, in charge of the world building, because he brings this world to life with his visuals. And both of us are kind of equally involved with the characterization. So what does our character do? What does this person say, like Nagesh? What is he? How is he going to look on the panel? So we kind of like collaborate on that, and I think it's a mixture of all of these things that do come in and become a story. And I'm fortunate enough to work with a few illustrators who I feel I've worked with them for so long that it we can just get into it, and I know their working style and vice versa, and we can just build a comic right off the get-go. So
Yeah,
yeah.
that's great. Kind of taking a detour, is there a comic of yours which you love the most? Is it, yeah, I know we have talked about Maithili, but if it's Maithili, you can say it.
No, it's not Maithili. That would be very yeah. Do you also accept manga? Because I
Yes.
read a lot of manga.
Okay.
So I read One Piece, which
Oh,
is
yeah.
by
Yeah, I
Oda.
was asking actually, what is the comic which you wrote, which you like the most? So
Oh,
that's why
the
I said,
which I've oh,
yeah.
okay. Let me think. I I I I think structurally, if I look back at stuff that I really think are, you know, it's some of the short comics that I've done for the big picture and Delete, basically,
Uh,
because I have one with Prabha Malia. It's one of my first comics. It's called Colonizing India in 10 Easy Steps.
yes, I saw it in your
Uh,
website. Yes.
yeah. I don't know if Mint still archives those, so I just took them and put them on my website, so it kind of just lives there. And I guess some of my favorite comics are the ones where the memories of working with the illustrator are just fun. Uh, so yeah,
Yeah.
that's how I gauge
I have
this
something to
thing. But
show you. This was like a magazine based out in Kochi called Motherland. You know,
yeah,
right? Like, and randomly I saw like uh, in the center page, there is your comic, right?
yeah,
Map maker.
I think this is with Vishnu who illustrated it, and
Exactly.
it's
This is by Vishnu M.
one of
Nayar,
those times where it just kind of works. Yeah,
uh, Map Maker.
yeah,
It's
and
a lovely comic. And just again, 4 pages. Was this done for Mint first or
no, this was
no?
done for Tina and Pratik. They
Yeah.
wanted it for this thing, so yeah.
Right. Great. Yeah. Even I have shown it to them like this only because it was very surprising to see a sudden Kokachi comic in a middle of a magazine, which I randomly
Yeah,
picked up. So that's great.
yeah.
Yeah. So now we go to your favorite comic or comic artist across the globe.
Oh yes, I read a lot of manga. I've been reading manga since 2006, 2008, ever since I was in school. And I before that I used to watch a lot of anime. Um, I don't know if you remember this, but at one point when there was this whole set-top box thing brought in, and
Yes.
you could only watch cable TV.
Yes.
Sorry, you can only watch like the normal channels on TV, and I think Animax was one of them,
Animax.
which
Yes.
was the greatest thing to have ever happened to our generation because it exposed us to so much amazing content that is
It
not
was just one anime after the other, and there was no break in between.
yeah,
And
and it was so different from the American British kind of comics basically. And yeah, I loved it. Like I used to follow Dragon Ball Z before that because I think it was on Cartoon Network. That was probably my first anime, like most people. Uh, but yeah, I think once Animax came, there was just one after the other. It was Card Captors, Sakura, Inuyasha, so on and so forth. And then there were so many of them, and I think maybe One Piece did play, but I didn't like it at the time. But then after a while, when I started reading the manga, I was just hooked. I think One Piece is currently on chapter 1000 something, 1100. I'm not sure. Or
is it like the longest running manga of all time?
yeah, it's almost as old as me. I think it started in 94, 95 or something like that, and it's about 4 years younger than me. And to just build a story, the world building, and to keep people entertained for so long, but more importantly, to write and illustrate 17 to 18 pages a week, it's just mad. Like if you think of it in terms of the scale of the work, I think it probably beats all the epic fantasies, maybe definitely Lord of the Rings. I would say it's the biggest piece of mega literature that we have, and it hasn't ended yet. I think it's about a good 4 to 5 years away from actually ending. So I have huge respect for Oda and just the world building and the way he puts things through. And a lot of things that I use with my own fantasy kind of comes from there, especially this thing called power scaling.
Hmm.
Um, because if your main character has all the powers, if they can do everything, then they have no obstacles to kind of beat. And I think power scaling is something that will come into play, that will have to come into play after the first arc or during the end of the first arc. And this is where the protagonist should realize that they're not as strong as they thought they were, or that they have a long way to go. And this is something that makes or breaks a series, in my opinion. You can also think about like the Marvel movies in this regard, because if they haven't done power scaling right, then the movie just kind of doesn't work.
Yes.
Um, so, which is why I feel like Captain America works better than some of the other, or Iron Man works better than some of the other Marvel movies, because you don't have a sense of what the hero is capable of.
Yes.
But anyway, I'm deviating
No, no, no.
basically. But
Please, please. I am very interested in that also. Yeah,
yeah,
you're
so
right.
I think
You're right. Yeah.
this is the next big challenge for Mighty in a Minotaur, because I think we've got world building and the characterization, we've got it penned down, and now we have to get to power scaling and make sure it kind of really makes sense. But yeah,
Yeah, they say that that's how villains are written. Like villains are mostly very rigid in their belief system. They are also too much powerful.
yeah,
But that
yeah,
thing necessarily doesn't work for a hero because hero has to come from a place of insecurity, come from a place of weakness, so that
yeah.
he
And usually I think how most of these is balanced is that you have the villain who is kind of here and the hero is kind of there,
mm,
and the hero never really truly meets the villain up here, but
no, it
it's
doesn't.
something happens where this happens, and they kind of, the villain also is on a decline at this point, because once you've hit your peak as a villain, like there's no way further up. Let's say there are other villains who are after you. You're getting older, you have your own insecurities that's making you come down, and whereas as a hero, once you battle your insecurities, like you're at rock bottom more or less. So there's only this way to go. Um, but what I had in mind more in terms of power scaling was if this character uh, only possesses a certain amount of power, like it's kind of it doesn't make sense for them to be able to match up to this thing right away, because they'll be killed almost instantly. So yeah, it's just something that it goes back to, like, school, and talking with your friends about, like, I don't know, in Tamil Nadu there's the Vijay versus Ajit
Oh
debate.
yeah, correct.
Yeah, so it's like, Vijay can do this, and then it's like, no, Tala can do this, and then similarly, in there's also like wrestling. It's like this Undertaker can come back from the dead, and that's why he can beat Kane. Kane is Undertaker's younger brother, and then there's also like football clubs, and then I kind of see them all as being in the same equation of things where,
You think
you know,
I think you think of a story in those, like those clashes also, you see a potential of a story brewing. Is that how you think? Like, very interesting to learn
yeah, I think no, I think that's how everyone thinks,
things. Correct.
because if you're watching a random movie which is, say, Vijay, and if you're watching another movie that is Ajit, they have nothing to do with each other. And
Mhm.
then somewhere in our minds we just go, this story and this story, let's peg them against each other. What will happen if we take this character from here and this character from here? And then, like, who is, like, has more mass, or who is like bigger,
I think that is
and
like you just cracked the
constantly do that.
formula of Marvel, right? Like that is exactly why we love Avengers a lot, because that is this bringing this different characters together for one single
Yeah,
movie, and suddenly it becomes interesting.
yeah, yeah, and that's why power scaling is important as well, because again, like, so Thanos in the movies is like super powerful, but in the comics you'll see like random police officers, like, kind of putting him in handcuffs and taking him away.
Yeah.
So but in the case of Marvel, I think they've been around for so long, and there've been so many comics and iterations, that I think the movies got a clean slate, and then they kind of got to build their thing from scratch. Um, but yeah, so it's very important to think of this right at the very beginning. Um, I can think of animes where they haven't done the power scaling right, and it's a mess. Like
Yeah.
Bleach, for example, used to follow it, but they didn't get the power scaling right, and then it just there's no way for you to go up. And if you're telling a large story, then it's something you definitely have to, because it needs to make logical sense to your viewers or readers. If not, they feel cheated, and then they kind of start hating you. So
Talking about manga culture, what do you think about the comic culture in India, and how far we have reached, and like what is the future looking?
oh, I think it's come a long way. I mean, I was fortunate to get into this during that peak, to the rise on top, basically. Excuse me one sec.
Sure.
Sorry, I had to burp.
That's
So you can leave this in, no need to edit it out or
okay.
anything. So yeah, I was fortunate enough to join in around 2012, 2013, 14ish. By that time, you had like people like, say, Orjit Sen, or even Apupan, who had, or even Priya actually had they've all done
Priya
comics,
Korea.
and yeah, so they're all sort of laid the groundwork more or less, or have done it. And then you had like the older generation, the which is like the golden age of Indian comics, where people from Amar Chitrakatha, etc. So you did have like a huge comic culture in its heyday back in the 80s, 90s, or at least like early 90s. I remember going to salons, like to cut my hair, and you'd have like a comic, like Lucky Lou or something like that, fully in Tamil, and people bought these and then they would read it. So and I think Doordarshan probably killed off comics, and the TV more or less killed it off. But again, it's coming back, or honestly, it never really went anywhere. Like after that, it reached this plateau where it just existed. Um, and then I think what happened with comics in India is that it started taking different routes. Like you have mainstream publishers getting interested in comics. So there you have Apupan stuff, and then you have things like Kari, um, and they sort of just and also Sarnath had a few things, and they it became its own little bubble and ecosystem. And then similarly on the other side of things, you had the indie comic movement. You had smaller independent publishers bringing out work. So I think this was Kokachi is a prime example. And then you had, I think, 3 or 4 more like Sufi comics, which you were talking about in the previous episode, is also a perfect example of an indie publisher who brought out 3 or 4 comics. And then there's also Holy Cow, who's managed to, I don't know how, do it and keep that demand up, and also figure out distribution. I guess you should talk to him next to figure out
Definitely.
the marketing and business side of things. Yeah, so it just started doing its thing. And I feel that comics now have reached a point where it it doesn't seem like a crazy um, thing to say that you're going to be a comic artist or a comic writer, basically. Uh, and in part, at least for me, this was because educational textbooks and the educational medium started embracing comics.
Yes.
Because a lot of the things that have brought me money have been in this space.
Mm.
It's either for ed tech, which pays very well, or conventional publishers don't pay as well, but you get to keep the rights. So every time the comic is printed, you get around 10,000, 15,000. So if you have like 10 of those, that's, income coming from somewhere. It's hard to keep a track of when your comic is being republished, reprinted, and all of that. But honestly, if it's just in the market, if it's just circulating around, then it's just living. And then you have zines, which is something that is completely new, and I'm very fascinated with it because you have so many newer storytellers telling really interesting, amazing stories with print runs of around 200 to 500. Um, and I guess it just morphing into these different things. And but if your question is, are comics going to come into the mainstream anytime soon? I don't think so. Maybe within certain subgenres,
Yeah.
I see a scope for comics to exist within the realm of children's publishing. Um, but other than that, as a piece of literature, as the graphic novel becoming, like popular, um, yeah, I don't know, maybe uh, just going by sales, I think the best, most popular comics in India have graphic novels have maybe sold around 3,000, 5,000, 7,000 copies at the most.
Yeah.
So yeah,
So
but
it
who
only,
knows? You never
yeah,
know.
but we never know. Yeah, yeah. Just wanted to know your take on that. And who is a comic artist in India whom you think people should pay more attention to? Is there somebody you can think of?
I can think of two very underrated artists actually. There's Devaki Nyogi,
Mm-hmm.
uh, who's got like very interesting work, very consistent. I love consistency in work more um, than kind of being someone who produces something that is amazing but then kind of just fades away. I love that slow build or that progression where someone puts out work and consistently does so. So I think Devaki is a good example, and another one is Shinando, who is Shinando C. So
Okay.
he basically does these noir type, or he's just known as the guy that does these dark noir-esque comics.
Mm.
And his work is amazing, very underrated in India, appreciated abroad, I guess. But yeah, and you have a lot of these artists who kind of just sit around, have almost zero social media presence. They just do their thing and then go away. So even with these two, I don't know if like they even like engage on social media and stuff. I mean, I shouldn't be one to talk because I also don't, because it's too time consuming. It takes way too much of time and it sucks the fun out of actually working on a comic. But yeah.
Uh, it's writing mostly lonely. Like I know it's the writing by default, it's a lonely thing to do, but when you collab with a comic artist, is it like less lonely? Like, do you figure out the story beats with Rajiv? Like, going back to the comic process again, I just thought about this. Like, do you go back to the work together? The story beats, do you work together with the illustrator, or when you have a complete story in your mind, then only you bring in the illustrator into picture and then start discussing? Is there?
So the way it's worked with Rajiv is that I have the complete story in mind. Remember when I said I take care of the plot and then Rajiv takes care of the world building? That may be a bit deceiving because I think I would say I take care of 80% of the plot. Rajiv takes care of 20%, and then world building kind of just flip that around. I take care of 20, he takes care of 80. And the reason I say this is because I shared the script for Forest of Forgotten Fears with Rajiv, and then he said after first read, towards the end, he wasn't convinced with the ending, basically, which prompted me to go back and add those extra 20 pages. Um, and it made complete sense, like the ending that we've come up with, and it's made it a much stronger book. So yeah, Rajiv gets absolute say in the story, and one of my favorite things to do is once everything is done. So I think this is around 1 month ago, when Rajiv had finished all the pencils, and he's actually right now he's coloring it, basically. I think he's got 25, 30, 40 pages to go maybe, which is why he's kind of in his hermit mode and doesn't go around much. But yeah, so my favorite bit is once everything is done, once I'm done with the writing, he's done with the illustration. So Rajiv, Smith, and I, we get on a call, and then we see, look for inadequacies, for redundancies in text, because if the images are there, a lot of times, you don't need the text telling you that that the moon is out when the image clearly has the moon out. And this is also when we get rid of a redundancy, we put in a joke because it makes it so much more fun. And it's really nice to just go back and make things funnier. And I think a lot of the humor from the book comes in here, because we can see the illustration already, and we just know how to make it a little more slapstick. And in this particular case, I think we did this in around 4 or 5 places, and it's definitely made it a lot funnier. And we doubt ourselves when we do this because we're like, are we just, are we just having fun, and is this just nonsense that we're putting in? But then we come back to it later, and it just makes so much more sense, and it makes it a much more nicer, yeah, piece of work. So with Maitli, it is definitely 100% a collaboration. With some of the other stories, I kind of write the entire thing, and then it just the illustrator just kind of does it, like illustrates it, and that's the end of it. But I kind of like working with illustrators to say, no, let's think of something else here, because it makes more sense. It's where they're making your writing more malleable, more flexible for their illustrations. And that's something that I love, those kind of collaborations. It's annoying, but
Yeah, I love this also. The first page of
oh yeah,
where it's almost like an Easter egg for the authors, right? Like where you
yeah,
talk about your likes, interest, and also I think my daughter who has read Dagga, like Dugga, found
yeah.
that dog also. It's like Rajiv's
That's right.
pet, right? And she
Yeah.
also drew her version of things.
Oh my God, that is so good. Okay. Yeah, that's
Yeah, her own like. So
yeah,
she told me like what exactly is this, and I told her like they have drawn their interest, likes, and things like that, and she
yeah.
quickly so she likes astronomy, so she has put in space and those things.
Oh no, this is exactly what it's there for, and I'm so
Right.
glad that you did this because um, it's again the reason why we love the comic format. And some stories I feel are better told as comics than as
Any other?
prose.
Sorry. Yeah.
Yeah,
My lab just fell off.
and
Sorry. Go ahead. Yeah.
no, don't worry about it. Yeah, so I feel like with comics you kind of make the reader part of the story, like they are the third side of the equation. So and there's this really cool thing which Scott McCloud talks about. It's called Murder in the Gutters. Have you heard about this?
No.
Um, okay, so the murder in the gutter is that you have an axe murderer basically.
Okay.
So in panel A, the axe murderer has the axe up and is about uh, to chop someone, I think. In panel B, you see like a man or something who's kind of coiled back like this. And in panel C, it's somewhere else. I think it's just almost black and there's a window and you just hear like the ah coming here. What your brain does is when you read this, it fills in the details. So you see the
Exactly.
axe going down and cutting this person down. And the comic makes the reader the third sort of
Wow.
creative involved in the process. So I think this is why it completely differs from the the visual medium. So like movies wherein it's just like I am telling you what to see, and then the entire movie plays out, which you know some stories need to be told that way. And then there is the prose medium, which is like come dream and imagine this world with me, which is why like when you ask people how they've seen this particular thing that they read in a book, it'll always be different. And that's why you always say, oh, but the book was so much different, because you have more control. With the comic, there is shared control, and it makes it so much more intimate as a medium. And that's what I love about writing comics.
Awesome.
Arguably, not all stories are meant to be told in comics, but the ones that are to be told this way, you get the maximum impact out of it. So yeah.
Thanks a lot, Raju. I think uh, we can wrap up the call. I would love to talk more and more, but I guess maybe we can have a
You
long.
said Rajiv.
Oh, I'm so
I
sorry.
think we've no, we've just sort of morphed into one person at this
Yeah,
point.
I'm so sorry.
So no,
Suddenly,
don't.
like, you know, yeah.
It's a
Because
huge
I guess I
compliment.
was just talking about Rajiv and his dog, Dugga, and suddenly that was
No,
there.
no, it's a
Sorry,
huge
CG.
compliment. It's basically we
Yeah.
merged into one being.
Generally, yeah,
So
whenever I have seen a lot of your talks also where you guys have given talks together.
yeah,
So yeah, I was really into the whole conversation also about that Scott McCloud and like the reason for comic, which is a nice note to
yeah,
end. So that's why I really want to wrap up. Thanks a
yeah.
lot, CG,
Sounds good.
for entering with
No,
it. So
thank you for taking
so
the time.
thanks.
Like, there's a lot of time that will go into editing this and putting this up, and
Yeah,
that's
but
just
it would
mad.
be my pleasure to listen to this again because definitely this has been a lot of helpful for me for sure. But I'm definitely sure for anyone who is interested in comics in India, they would find this really helpful. Thanks a lot, CG.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Thanks so much for having me.
Sure. Thank you.